Welcome to Seven Skills for the Future podcast. This podcast is based on my book, Seven Skills for the Future, published by Pearson Business, and both book and podcast are all about developing and nurturing 7 key skills. These skills are adaptability, empathy, critical thinking, integrity, being proactive, being optimistic, and being resilient. And I 100% believe and know that when we nurture these skills and when we give them focus, our lives become much happier as a result. Our relationships are easier. We are likely doing work that we really enjoy and love, and we just know how to manage ourselves in a much, much better way. And today I am talking to Catherine Lejtenyi. Catherine is based in Berlin. She is the daughter of a Hungarian refugee who participated in the 1956 revolution. And she is Canadian and a very successful and highly accomplished communications coach. Catherine specializes in intercultural communication, and we talk in this podcast about how you bring your intercultural awareness or non-awareness to just about every single encounter that you can possibly have. And that's both important when you're living and working in another country, when you're traveling, but also in your own environment. We link this to integrity, and we talk about how this ties in with values and what makes a really great communicator. And I love talking to Catherine because she is so passionate about her work, and she's so knowledgeable. So I hope you enjoy the interview today, and if you are loving this podcast, please post a review because it really helps with rankings. So whatever platform you're listening to this on, I'm really grateful if you could take the time to post a review about the podcast. And thanks for listening. Welcome back to Seven Skills for the Future podcast. And today I'm delighted to be welcoming Catherine Lejtenyi from Berlin to the podcast. Thank you so much, Catherine, for coming along today.
Hi, I'm Sue. Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm really interested to talk to Catherine about her work in intercultural communication and coaching, because she uses and links a lot of what she does to integrity. And of course, because that's one of the 7 skills, I'm really interested to get her angle on how that fits and works with communication. So Catherine, tell us more about your work.
Oh, thanks for asking, Emma Sue. So I've been working with international clients for about 13 years. Of course, most of my clients are German, but I also have a few from around the world. And one of the things that became clear to me over the years is that when people need support in communicating because they're meeting some roadblocks, it's oftentimes not just the English that they're speaking as this lingua franca or this international language, but it's also the intercultural skills. And it's also about how people feel when they're sort of unmoored from their culture. Mm-hmm. And one thing I've learned is that I don't think there's a measurable amount, but I would say roughly half of the way that we communicate is through cultural references. And so when you're, as I said, unmoored from your culture, you lose already half of the way you're communicating. Plus, you're doing it in a foreign language. So there's a lot of insecurity and inner sort of agitation that happens. So the coaching is aimed at, first of all, getting people to feel and express themselves, to feel authentic and to express themselves authentically when they're speaking international English. Mm-hmm. And then also to be aware of how culture is functioning in them and how culture functions in the people they're speaking to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you say unmoored from your culture, do you mean simply because you're speaking in a different language to your own. Is that what you mean? You're away
Well,
from your country, or?
yeah, so there's a language, but there's also just the sets of values and modes of expression that come from your culture, which turns out often to be very, very local. I'll give you a very simple example. My brothers and I grew up in the era of The Simpsons. So when we think the other person is not getting something, or they say something really obvious, we say, duh. And that would not work, obviously, in cultures that have no concept of The Simpsons.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have to really be sensitive to what other people's parameters are. And then I think what's important is just to find ways in yourself to say, okay, I can't use those references, but what's going to come out is something that's me nonetheless. And so if English is not their native language, but that's the language that they have to speak for their international business or international operations, that they don't master the language that they're using to express themselves.
Mm-hmm. But I guess that applies to everybody, because even if English is your native tongue, you're still going to be communicating with other people using English. So it's not just for non-native speakers, right?
That's right. I mean, so far I haven't coached native speakers, and I'd be very interested in doing that. In fact, a colleague of mine in London, who in a very different sector, when I told him about what I do in terms of trying to create a sense of equality and mutual understanding in international settings, he said, I would love to take part in that kind of workshop, because he's noticed himself, even as a Brit, that there are intercultural misunderstandings that arise simply because of cultural difference, not necessarily because of linguistic differences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure those happen all the time, because we use those parameters we make assumptions based on those parameters, right?
Totally.
So,
yeah. That's why another thing, I mean, one of the things, I actually have a little video about this, but what I really advise people as the most important skill that you can bring to intercultural communication is politeness. And the reason for that is that the politeness you show to a person is a measure of your respect for their dignity as a human being. And so even if unintentionally you transgress that parameter or that standard, what you're doing is you're transgressing their sense of dignity. And that can really ruin a budding relationship very easily.
You see, for me, when I hear you say that, it does actually link to empathy for me, because in order to be able to be sensitive in the way that you're talking about, it does require you to be really paying attention, really in the moment, really listening, and this kind of awareness of the other person.
Yes, no, you're totally right, because I think also one of the skills that I train in my workshops is exactly the ability to not only decipher verbal but also nonverbal signals. And you are right that this looking and hearing and sort of interpreting, what does that pause mean? What does it mean that there's, maybe stepping away or stepping forward? Yes, you're right. I think empathy, that acute awareness, is definitely part of intercultural training.
But you see, I also think that's one of the things that's really hard for us, because our awareness is not great. We're rushing around all the time.
Yeah.
We're crazy.
Yeah.
We're not. I mean, I'm sure you must come across that in your sessions. You must come across people who are just find it hard to really be in the moment, to be present.
To be present, yeah. I'm trying to think. I think I've been in some ways very fortunate, because I would say German culture, and certainly the clients that I have had here, aren't so driven by this hectic need to get forward in the rat race. I think there are luckily still a lot of mechanisms in German society that help maintain an okay work-life balance. So it's not really so much what I have found, the being in the moment, although of course everyone can benefit from that. It's really more about raising awareness of, when something seems unfamiliar, that doesn't necessarily mean bad, and it doesn't mean you need to shy away from it. That's when you should be exercising curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And then with that empathy, I think empathic curiosity is the key to good communication.
And can you tell us a bit about how you do that? How do you use that in your coaching? Or in your workshops?
How do I use empathy and curiosity?
Yeah, how do you help people to how do you help people to raise their awareness of those skills and to use those skills?
Well, I do some role playing, because what's been difficult is that very often when I'm doing this at my existing clients, so they know each other if it's in company. So you have to do some role playing, and there are also exercises. I'm a certified ORSC coach. That's an ICF certified program in coaching, which is systems coaching. And so there are a lot of exercises just to, I think, help accentuate difference as a way of creating better bonds and links. So there are exercises that you can do. For example, you just pull some tape on the ground and you make a kind of Mercedes sign or a peace sign. And it's my world, your world, our world. And when people really start to unpack who they are, that often becomes quite surprising. And then you invite the other person into your world to get a feeling a little bit of what that space is like. And then the other person has their turn doing it. And then after that sort of mutual recognition, you create a third space, which is our world. So how do you want to now create a space or a world or an office, for example, with this combined knowledge of what makes us as people tick? Because of course, I'm sure you're aware of intercultural communication is really, at the end of the day, interpersonal communication. Right.
Of course it is. Yeah. So how do they respond to that kind of exercise when you do that?
They like it. I was very lucky because I've done it with software programmers and controllers and people in finance departments. So they're not always really used to this kind of creative thinking outside the box, but it creates a lot of aha moments.
I bet it does.
Yeah,
I bet it does.
It really does. And I think a lot of people in more traditional industries are still surprised that your work atmosphere improves when personal relationships are warmer, more human, more personal.
And it's such an obvious thing, isn't it? Well, maybe it's obvious to us.
We're so advanced. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think it is really interesting because I often feel also with the work I do, I think, well, isn't this obvious? But then I realize actually it's not. And it's about, I guess it's also about what you do every day and how you bring some of these things into your day-to-day actions and your thinking and your awareness. Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's a lot of it has to do with my upbringing. And this is sort of it shouldn't be a point of pride, but it kind of is. I grew up on a street of about 18 or 20 homes with 12 different nationalities on it. And that was just one street. I could go 2 streets down and then there were a bunch of other nationalities. So I was going from one friend's house and having, tandoori chicken for dinner. The next day, this is really kind of what happened. It would be empanadas, a third day Wiener Schnitzel, And as kids, because it was a nice, thriving young neighborhood, we would all just play together. And what's amazing as children, of course, you go from one home to the other and you just adapt to the customs because, you think, well, this is what the grown-ups here tell me to do, So, and I had a Lebanese friend, and it's funny that these examples are all based on food, which you can sort of see one of my main values. But it was really we'd sit around at the dinner table and we would just take pita bread and eat from the common pot in the middle of the table. And so I'm reducing it to food, but of course it was a lot more than that. So when, as a child, already you're used to navigating different cultures, that's something that you grow up with. And Montreal, where I was born and raised, is a really fantastic city because you have all the cultures in the world. And Canada is different from the US in the sense that it's not the melting pot. We don't want to, bring people from other countries and just melt them into, Americans. We cherish the cultural mosaic of all the different backgrounds. No
wonder you're doing the work that you do now.
Yeah, it's kind of one line, very much so.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about integrity and authenticity, because I know that these are really important parts of your work.
Yeah. So, I'm a little bit, I try not to broadcast this, but I am a little bit critical of this sort of rampant consumer capitalism that we live in, that defines our current economy. And I am of the opinion that a lot of this sort of self-promotion that you see, a lot of the selfies and the social media are all about presenting a certain image, and it doesn't really matter what stands behind that image. And for me and my values, I think we need to do the opposite. I think we should not focus so much on image, but really focus on a behavior that honors relationships. So first of all, you have to have some values. I think that's also really important. And then you have to communicate those values and stand by those values. So Brené Brown talks about that. She says, integrity is not just something you preach. It's having values and acting according to them. And I think that's really important. Yes.
But how do you work out what your values are?
Well, that's really interesting because that also links into authenticity. So that it's not exactly the same, but it links into it. I think we all owe it to ourselves to take some time out, be it a chunk of time in our lives or part of the day, to connect with ourselves and say, this is what's important to me. This is less so, and I want to live according to this. If you're a person who thinks, relationships are important and it is important to be connected, then I think there are a series of values and principles that develop from that feeling and that core value. And I think you can't say that connection and relationships are important and then not act in a respectful way towards others.
Yeah, so I can see how with values, you do have to delve quite deep, don't you? Because you can easily sort of say to yourself, well, this is something I really value, like generosity or kindness or, whatever the value might be. But in actual fact, if that's not present or visible in your everyday life, then it's probably not really a value, or it needs to be strengthened.
Well, exactly. It's really interesting. I think like values and there's so much to be said. This is you can literally write books on this topic. The Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek talks about the mask and how the mask you project. Everyone says like, oh, the mask that you project is this false, fake thing. And he argues against that. And so if I could riff off of what he says, sometimes we project these values and we do believe in them, but we don't necessarily know how to connect that to something deeper inside us. So this could also be a topic for like year-long therapy, but if you can make it in a more day-to-day way. This can also emerge in the coaching. And there are ways of taking a time out for yourself in the coaching space and externalizing things that are important to you, things that are of value to you. And a lot of that just has to do a little bit with what you were saying too about, like, you know, coming to yourself and taking that moment. And if you can take that moment and say, you know what, this value, generosity, for example, or compassion is really important to me and it resonates with something inside me, then I'm going to put that to the fore. I also know people, for example, and which I respect just as much, who would say, you know, empathy and compassion aren't that important to me. I know very successful business people who got to their positions exactly because they did not have many social skills. But if they tell me honesty and respect are very high values for me, I can work with that. And I respect that as well. But I think you have to know what they are, and you have to let other people know what they are and allow them to respond.
I really like that. I think that's such a valuable tool to give people, to give them that space to explore that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that then brings it really, really back to integrity, because I think if you are transparent about who you are and what's important to you, then what happens with that is that you give people the free choice to decide how they want to deal with that. And if you don't do that, and if you don't let people know what your values are and what really drives you, that can be a trap for people. And I don't think that's okay.
Do you think values are, do they transcend cultures?
Oh, that's universal? Interesting. I think there definitely is some values that are universal, but they will be expressed through their culture. So in this, I gave a talk at a BSIG conference actually in October. So that's a conference for business English trainers and English as a foreign language or English as a lingua franca. And I talked about intercultural communication. And one of the points I raise is that you're never truly free from culture. You're never a blank slate. But I would say, yes, I think those things that happen between human beings, you know, when a mother smiles at her child, as the most basic example, that happens in every culture, but things everything around it will be particular to a culture.
Yeah, but I think that there's probably strong moments of connection, you know, which are universal. So that recognition, like you say, a mother with her child, and that tenderness, that's something that connects us. I think something like that connects us.
For sure.
Yeah. Tell us what else you're doing. I know you often have interesting little videos up on LinkedIn. What are those? Can you tell us about those?
So those videos, the early days, my salad days, about a year ago, I was making videos, a little bit of tips about learning English. And now I'm talking much more about factors and facets in intercultural communication. So as I said, the politeness video, I have one video on the topic of meta communication. So if you're communicating with someone, particularly if you're using English as the foreign language for both of you, and you've noticed that you're sort of not understanding each other, you're understanding the words, but not really the meaning, then it's good to take a step out of that moment and say, and explore why we're not understanding each other, create a common basis for understanding, and then return into the communication.
Oh, I really like that. I think that's something that's so valuable for, well, anybody really.
I mean, oh God, yeah. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, because I think when we have a situation where we're not communicating well with somebody, it's so easy to just kind of fall into, I guess sort of default behavior and not actually say, okay, let's let's look at this, let's create a space, let's find how we can actually communicate well. But it's almost like you're not allowed to do that somehow. It feels like that anyway in certain organizations.
Yeah, totally. I mean, if the climate is really competitive and aggressive, then it will really be hard. I mean, so this is also where it gets back to this coaching school, if you will, that I did. It's called ORSC coaching, Organization Relationship Systems Coaching. And it focuses on groups and organizations or teams and departments, things like this. And one of the things that happens at the beginning of a coaching session is the question gets asked, what kind of climate or atmosphere do we want to create? And what are the values of our communication? So people will throw out respect, listening, non-action, action, non-judgment, curiosity, exploration, things like this. So once, and the thing is, what's really interesting about that is everything is a question of articulation. Once you articulate those ideas and those, in a sense, those feelings or those states of mind, then people can access them. I think what's happening is we're pushing away all those ideas in order to be more productive and, win-win-win and profitable and things like this.
Really interesting. So how can we find out more about what you do? Can you tell our listeners details about your website, your LinkedIn profile, the book that you're going to write one day, I hope?
Thank you so much for that encouragement. Yes, absolutely. So there's my YouTube channel. I will send you all the links. It's probably the easiest way because I've actually forgotten what all these, the specificities of my LinkedIn, or my LinkedIn I still know because it's my name, but the YouTube channel and my blog, I think my blog is bespokeninternational.wordpress.com. And the blog, to be honest, because I was always, I have a weak spot for reading and writing. And the blog is almost what gives me the most joy in my work. And I mean, I think it's really interesting.
Well, I have to say, I have read a couple of your blogs and I read them and I think, my gosh, this is like a chapter of a book.
Thanks.
So, I think that it could definitely be turned into a book, but we'll make sure that we have all those links in the show notes so that you can access Catherine's website and her blogs and her videos. And I strongly encourage you to do so and delve more deeply into this topic. And Catherine, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been wonderful having you.
Emma Sue, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the 7 Skills for the Future podcast. There are all sorts of things you can do to boost each of the 7 skills. If you want more ideas, you can buy the book, 7 Skills for the Future. You can also go online to our website, Unimentor, and join as a member, and you'll be able to access more resources, ideas, and free downloads. If you have a question you want to ask on these podcasts, get in touch through Instagram at 7 Skills for the Future, or on Twitter and Facebook at Unimentor. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast player of choice.